Good evening, I'm Mitchell Moss, and I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Dean of the Wagner School, Sherry Glide, who could not be with us tonight. And I want you to know that we're here because the Wagner School has new offices on 17th Street, and our terrific event space is just being completed this month. So we're delighted to be in the Academic and Spiritual Center, which I already feel. Now, I want to say two things which are important, I think. One is that the Rice family has been generous supporters of NYU's Wagner School, the Rice Fellowship, the Rice Forum here tonight, the Rice Professorship, and the Rice Conference Room. And what makes them different than other donors, and I think I've dealt with a lot of donors, is that they don't just write a check, they care. And they have been giving us advice and ideas and energy to make what we do at the Wagner School better and more connected to our students. And this forum is exactly what is part of that mission. I'm very old-fashioned, and that's an understatement. I don't think a university should be confined to just the classroom or the laboratory, especially not one like NYU, the largest university in the largest city in the country. And so the forum today is an example of what we should be doing all the time, which is bringing people and ideas together, not in the Zoom room, but in the physical room. And so I want to thank each of you for coming here tonight. Now, we have a purpose here, which is we're celebrating the work of Henry Hart Rice. And let me say that we have several of his family members here, and I appreciate the different members who are here, but I just want to thank Eve Rice, Tim Madison, and Nate Madison. But I want to say that Henry Hart Rice was a pioneer. He was responsible for the initial rent control laws in New York. He's one of the few people who actually took on Robert Moses and defeated him. He wrote the policies to preserve Carnegie Hall. This is true. And Robert Moses was a bulldozer in person, but he also was a bulldozer in trying to get rid of Carnegie Hall. He was able to keep it, so we still have a great music hall while we have the acoustically challenged Philharmonic Hall at Lincoln Center. So we have someone, I think, tonight who builds on that legacy as a visionary, and that's Vishaan Chakrabarti. And those of you who don't know Vishaan, you should know that during the Bloomberg administration, he was the director of the Manhattan Office of Planning. His work has been felt and can be seen in the Domino Sugar Refinery, which has just recently opened on the Brooklyn waterfront. In the Cleveland, the only thing good in Cleveland, apart from, I guess, Cleveland Clinic, is the Cleveland, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And you know, he's had even an impact beyond the borders of this country. He went to Belfast innocently, tried to bring the Catholics and the Protestants together with Rob Walsh, and with a new landscape and streetscape on the waterfront. He tried, you know, which is more than most people. But I just want you to know he was the dean of the Worcester College of Environmental Design at the University of California at Berkeley. He's taught at many different places. He's the author of a brand new book, and we are selling it outside. I just want you to know there's a commercial here, you know, at the end of the talk, so you should know that it's available. But most of all, I think he's been vitally involved in some of the great things in New York, helping to reimagine the High Line, plan for the number 7 train, and help shape the rebuilding of the World Trade Center. And I just want you to know that I can't tell you there's a better person at this time to talk about the issues facing cities and New York than Vishaan Chakrabarti. Vishaan.
Hi, everyone. It is a great honor to be here. Thank you to the Rice family. It is really a pleasure to be with Mitchell, with the Wagner School. And it's great to see an event where they serve wine before the lecture starts. It gives me a little bit of a leg up. And so I'm going to make an argument to you tonight about why something I care about deeply, architecture, matters to the big issues of our time. Climate change, social division, and this is a lecture taking place in a public policy school, and maybe architecture is not the first thing that people think about when they think about the big issues of our time. So why don't we dive in, and you can see if I can convince you. So I'm going to start. This is one of my favorite. It's a Paul Klee painting that is related to a Walter Benjamin quote that Laurie Anderson uses as a lyric in one of her songs, "History is an angel being going backwards into the future." I think most of our struggles as a species have to do with history and our struggles with history. If you think about what's happening in the Middle East, if you think about Putin's kind of obsession with the old Soviet Union, if you think about Make America Great Again, so these are things that are all about our kind of our relationship, good or bad, with what we perceive to be our histories. And architecture is no different. Architecture in many ways is both a mirror and a window into our struggle with history. So in the 20th century, I'm sure many people at Wagner are very familiar with the history of urban renewal. Mitchell mentioned Robert Moses. You know, the basic paradigm of just flattening neighborhoods, starting from scratch. I think the 21st century is very different. It is about how do we bring history forward. And this is what I love about this image, because the idea of bringing history forward into the future is an extraordinarily complex affair, much more complex than tabula rasa thinking where you just tear everything down. Whose history do you bring forward? How do you bring it forward? And this notion that it's an angel being blown backwards into the future, to me is such a great image, because it represents that struggle of carrying history forward with all of its baggage, its trauma, and into a future that feels very, very shaky right now. And I think, you know, it's hard to not be a little depressing about the fact that the future sort of barely exists. And I think for a lot of young people, and for those of us who teach, I'm teaching at Cornell right now, and for those of you who teach here, I'm sure you hear this from students and or just even from our own kids, that it's really hard to be optimistic right now, given the challenges of technology, AI, social media, given the extraordinary affordability crisis. And by the way, if you look at the affordability crisis in like real dollar terms, it's not what our generation dealt with. This generation's up against a much, much harder state of affairs. Obviously, the intense amount of political division in the country, and then the thing that is the overarching challenge over all of that, which is climate change as we look at these storms roiling in the south, you know, all over the world, all these weather events. And that is the future that our young people face. And so to try to be optimistic about that, to try to think about, well, how could we think about a world in which we can harmonize all of that? I have to start, especially as an immigrant born in India, I have to start with the world. And the world's a big place. We're over 8 billion people today. The UN, these are UN numbers, estimates that by the end of this century, we will be almost 11 billion people. Most of those people will live in what the UN categorizes as urbanized areas, cities or suburbs, with, you know, you can see what's happening with rural populations. And you will hear sort of contradictory statements around this. So just as you see this graph and you see that population is rising, you will also hear a lot about the fact that population's falling, birth rates are declining precipitously. And the reason is it's two different trends. So what we have is, in most of the developed world, declining birth rates. In Western Europe, below replacement rate. And in some countries, Japan and especially South Korea, almost to the point of crisis, where you are not seeing new population being born to replace existing population and all of the challenges that are concomitant with that. But at the same time, you see that in Asia and Africa, right, there are very differing trends. China has probably peaked out because of the single child policy and so forth. India will peak out in the not too distant future. But enormous parts of Africa, enormous parts of Asia, excluding India and China, are still continuing to grow. Now, when I talk about this, and the book starts with this, it tends to give audiences, and especially Western audiences, a lot of angst. Because how can you think about things like climate change when you think about this kind of population growth? Well, I'm gonna ask you to not have quite so much angst for a couple of different reasons. One, I think we should welcome people. Our history of population control in the world is not very good. Two, understanding what caused all of this, right? These graphs track completely with where colonialism took place, where slavery took place, where there's a lack of women's rights, where there's a lot of agrarian poor. My father was from a very rural village in India. There were large families because people were farmhands as children. And so we need to have, I think, a little bit more sympathy in understanding all of this, and also some hope associated with it, because I don't look at this as all a bad thing. Because, like, take climate change. Look at these two graphs, and again, this is UN data. On the left is carbon emissions per person, right? On the right is where the population growth is. They are almost the converse of each other. So before we start wringing our hands about all this population growth happening in other places, we should remember that we're the primary problem when it comes to climate change. And that actually there are people who think Africa could be the first net zero continent in the world for a whole bunch of reasons. So, you know, when you dig more, this is Berkeley data actually, when you get even more granular with this, you will see that these are obviously the eastern seaboard. Cities, for not unsurprising reasons, do very well in terms of carbon emissions per capita because mass transit, especially because we live in apartment buildings which heat and cool each other as opposed to single-family homes, which are terrible thermal envelopes. To me, the more surprising aspect of this data is the rural areas, where you think those are huge expanses of land. People have to drive a lot, they use a lot of heavy equipment. You'd think that that would have a very high carbon emissions rate. But the reason that's not true is because those are conservation cultures. People do not get in a big pickup truck only to go get a quart of milk. The problem's in between. The problem's very firmly in between, and that's because of single-family homes, it's because of driving everywhere, it's because of landscaping equipment. Like the list goes on and on and on. And we can't green tech our way out of this problem. Right? I spent a lot of time looking at this and researching this. You cannot slap a bunch of solar panels on 20th century technology and imagine that this is all going to be fine. When we build subdivisions, we destroy local agriculture, we do all sorts of land degradation. The fires that you see out west, this is because we keep building into areas where we don't belong. When you see those crazy articles about, oh, the bears are attacking our subdivision, no, you attack them. Right? And so green tech is not going to solve this problem, and yet this problem has become a global problem. We basically invented this form of living. We redefined it as a form of success. So when the American dream was first written about, it was not about houses and cars. It was written about as equal opportunity for every man and woman in the country. After World War II, we turned that into a material dream of a car and of a house and 2 cars and so forth. That definition of success then spread worldwide. So about 2 billion people have entered the middle class since the 1990s around the world, right? I've seen it in India, you can see China, Turkey, Russia, wherever you go, and they've decided that this is success. And so you've seen the same irrigated desert outside of Riyadh that you'll see outside of Phoenix, right? And so it's banal, it's not urbane, but I'm going to argue that this is banal as well. That this is 6 cities around our downtowns, and we're not doing much better in city building. Our cities are homogeneous increasingly as they grow. People don't know where they are when they land in a particular city. It's kind of the same tower with the same Starbucks at the bottom. And so this is a real, and of course, it's unaffordable. And so this is an enormous problem. Where are people going to live? How are 10.4 billion people going to live? How are we going to think about building differently? So I think we have to kind of go back to basics. And the pandemic helps us because it's an enormous reset, right, for us to think about. And if the pandemic did the thing that people have been thinking about since the invention of the telephone, which is that we were all going to live in a mountaintop and not do this, what we're doing right now. Thank you, Mitchell, for the precursor about not being on Zoom, although I know there's some people on Zoom. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But we as a species, across every continent, have built collective environments for far more than economic or commercial reasons. largely actually for spiritual and cultural reasons. We have built places where we could be together, right? Across time, across geography. And so that to me is kind of the beginning point. I'm building this thing that I call urbanity. Now, when I say the word urbanity, most of you might think about big cities. You might think about things that are cosmopolitan. I'm going to argue that that's not urbanity at all. That urbanity can manifest at any scale. And it's really about building places, physical places, where people come together and meet eyeball to eyeball, and especially people of difference. And that can happen in small towns. It can happen, that's Schitt's Creek, you might recognize it. It's actually a real place, Goodwood, Canada. Or Hong Kong. It can happen at all scales. To me, the much more important definition and criteria for urbanity is not size. It is whether or not we are celebrating difference. And so to me, there are plenty of big cities that are not very urbane, because we segregate our populations. There are small towns that can be quite urbane because we celebrate difference. There's also a big difference between this idea of urbanity and this idea of community. Now, the idea of community has become so sacrosanct that God forbid any of us ever criticize it. But to me, the largest issue that I encounter, because I deal with a great deal of community engagement in my work, is the degree to which we become tribal, right? Where we collect together, not just in terms of race and faith, but how we vote, how we think, to the point where we have stopped interacting with people who are different than us. I've driven cross country 6 times, twice with my son. I know the red states pretty well. They are not the caricatures that blue states make them out to be any more than the blue states are the characters that the red states make them out to be. And the reason we don't understand that is because we don't interact with each other. And this is where I believe that physical space becomes that much more important. It's also critically important, we're finding more and more, in terms of our health and our longevity. Because there's this great book, The Good Life, by Waldner and Schultz. It's the longest study of human happiness that's been done. It's conducted at Harvard University. And what it proves that basically if you control for a bunch of factors like smoking and exercise and stuff, that you will live longer and have a happier life if you have stronger social connections. This seems actually fairly intuitive if you think about it. So my question as an architect is, how do you build places that build stronger social connections among people? There's also something fundamental about urbanity in terms of creating progress in the world. This is actually a diagram from a Greek city planner named Doxiades. And he had this theory, well, this was well before blue people and red people as we think about them. He had this theory that every once in a while someone was born who thought differently. And they thought differently than the people around them, and so they sought out more people like them, and what they ended up having to do is find denser and denser circumstances to find these people who thought differently, to the point where they finally got to that last slide, where not only did they find people like themselves with whom they could collaborate and think differently, but their thoughts became contagious, right? And that spread some new set of ideas, some sense of progress. This could be a diagram of the Arab Spring, right? So what are the physical conditions we need? Because, and I emphasize the word physical because digital ain't quite doing it, right? What are the physical conditions we need to promote, be conducive to these conditions that I'm talking about? Well, first of all great urban places in my mind have great public space, a great public realm. Some of them in ways that we didn't even design them to be. Like, these are drawings from Mark Wagner in my office who does these beautiful sketches. That one in the upper right, that's the bottom, that's Norman Foster's building in Hong Kong. And famously, maids who are largely Filipino gather there on Sundays under the building. This, I assure you, Norman did not intend this when this was designed this way, nor did HSBC, but it's become a phenomenon. And so how people use public space is incredibly important. So I do believe architecture is critically important to this, and the design of our public realm is incredibly important to this. And part of why I think a lot of you as public policy people don't think of us necessarily as the folks And I will say I wear both hats. I studied urban planning and architecture, but I think a lot of the reason that we're not thought about as terribly relevant to this is because for a long, long time, we've been on the wrong side of history. We've been about celebrity and all of these other things. That's changing. The Pritzker is starting to give prizes to people who work with vulnerable communities, building urbanity, a lot in the global south. We're starting to see great housing and other forms of architecture. That's in Dublin, speaking of my friend Rob Walsh. And it's an amazing piece of actually fairly low-income housing. Some of you might recognize Michael Malson's project, Star Apartments in Los Angeles for the formerly unhoused. That's a mosque in Dhaka, Bangladesh by a woman named Marina Tessabon that also serves as a community center. So there is starting to be these really extraordinary places that we're building. And not just by architects. Mayors are doing amazing things. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what Anne Hidalgo's been doing. Famously, the bus rapid transit in Bogota, the cable car in Medellin, our shared bike system. And then amazing new social housing programs and projects in places like Paris and Vienna. And the reason I really point those out is because many of you will be familiar with the idea of European social housing. What is absolutely new is the welcome to immigrant populations into that social housing, which has not typically been the case, and especially in the downtowns of these cities. As well as, roadway reclamation projects, all sorts of things that are going on that I think are building this condition of urbanity. Okay, so I'm trying to go from pessimism to optimism here. So these are the things I think about and write about, and what I want to do now, and this is right around the corner from the new Wagner operation on 18th Street. This is my office. What I want to do now is just give you some examples of what we try to do to pull history forward and to try to build connective space, and then close with some thoughts, especially around housing. So this is the kind of work we do. We try to keep thought leadership at the center of everything. We do infrastructure, housing, a lot of cultural and educational work. We think co-design is absolutely critical in terms of working with communities and user groups. We started with a lot of advocacy work. We've had a lot of great collaborations with the New York Times around ideas like road diets. This is something that I still think we need to do, is eliminate or at least reduce drastically the amount of private cars in the city for all sorts of better uses. And that has led to a lot of great urban planning work that I won't go through in detail, a lot of it in the industrial Midwest, which again, working in the places where the blue pixels and the red pixels meet, I think is incredibly important right now. And then other advocacy work, this is around Penn Station. If I really wanted to talk about this, would be here for an hour or 3 hours. But I continue to believe that we are not embarrassed enough about what Penn Station is and how unsafe it is, and what again, we can talk about this later, but a lot of advocacy work there that has led to a lot of our architecture portfolio, from everything from work for the FAA to other projects. And so I'm going to go through a couple of those quickly, and like I said, close with some housing thoughts. So our first built project in Columbus, Indiana, which is this place where they hired lots of famous architects, Sarin and Pei, and we were asked to do something very small, an acupuncture project in the heart of the downtown, because remote work has hit them as well. This is the headquarters, this little town in Columbus, Indiana. This is where Cummins Engine is located. And we were asked to just help downtown somehow. And so we won this prize, and we went out and did a lot of community engagement. And we proposed, based on what we heard from the community, to create a canopy over an intersection, kind of in a one-stoplight town. We got the city engineer high on ice cream and got him to remove the stoplight and put in a stop sign. And we proposed this canopy, and there it sits in a very historic context. And what's important about this is it has invited the very, very conservative mayor to close her streets as often as possible to allow public functions to happen here. And so this thing has to exist out in the snow in Columbus, but what's been amazing about it is it has been a platform, just a simple canopy over a street with some lighting, right, and some speakers. And it has been a platform for some of the most diverse communities you will ever see in Mike Pence's Indiana, right? From Pride Week to African American festivals, Japanese kids, the South Asian dancers, who have all told us to a person that they never felt any invitation to be downtown or connect with each other until this canopy was built, which is kind of extraordinary if you think about it. And it reminds me of what one of my favorite architects from history, whatever space and time mean, place and occasion mean more. That's Al Van Eyck. And what he was talking about is architecture by itself has no meaning. It only has meaning through people's use, right? And how people have an invitation there. This on a much larger scale, there are many nice things in Cleveland, Mitchell, including a terrific mayor, Justin Bibb. We won a competition to do something absolutely terrifying, which is to build upon one of I.M. Pei's masterworks and one of his worst buildings. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which was designed to look like a turntable from space. Not a good diagram in terms of function. Anyway, I won't go through this in detail. We are attaching to the Pei building, using some of his language in a very different way, and building new public space. And the main reason I raise it in this audience is because, so that new triangle intersecting the existing pyramid is our new building, and it's both kind of reverent to the Pei structure and kind of irreverent to the Pei structure. But what's really key about it is it creates a new entrance, and that new entrance has to negotiate this grade change of about 20 feet down to Lake Erie. And so in that, what we are doing is creating an amphitheater that is, we convinced the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to make this unticketed space. So it costs about $20 to get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And one of the amazing things about working on this project is you get to hear people like Paul McCartney talk about how he got his start. And he was a teenager in Liverpool. And so I thought about a teenager in Cleveland. And like, they can't afford $20 to get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but they can come and hang out here and have jam sessions and have coffee. And so the notion that you would build this kind of public space, an interior public space, because Cleveland has some bad weather every once in a while, it was very, very important. And so this is under construction right now with a new concert hall. And then Domino, Mitchell mentioned this. This has been something I've been working on for about 10 years in my former firm and now at POW with an extraordinary landscape architect who's also the landscape architect for the High Line, Lisa Switkin from Field Operations. So this is Jed and David Walentis, just extraordinary clients. One of the first things they did was build this park. I like talking about the playground in this park an awful lot because there are 4 communities that live around this site. There's an Orthodox Jewish community, there is an African American community, a Latinx community, and a kind of hipster community. And prior to the construction of this park, it was very clear to me, because we had a ton of community board meetings, that these communities did not interact at all. And now you see all their kids playing together in the playground. And when I see that, and I think about, say, the Middle East, I think that these kids are going to fundamentally have a different view of the world as a consequence of having played together and having to interact in real space together. And that to me is, as I'm saying, urbanity. Our assignment became doing something about the landmark, the sugar refinery itself, very troubled history with slavery. I'm sure many of you saw Kara Walker's brilliant piece, Sugar Baby, that was about 10 years ago. We had some much more challenging technical problems. The building isn't even a building. In actuality, it was housed to put all this sugar refining equipment in. Sugar refining is disgusting, don't eat refined sugar. Jed called me and said none of the windows line up because the building was built in different phases, so you couldn't strike a floor across because like a wheelchair couldn't get across that floor. It'd have all these steps. There's no light coming in the building, the windows are small, landmark, you can't make the windows bigger. And I drew this sketch while he was talking. I said, Jed, we have to build a building inside the building, like a kind of ship in a bottle. And so our argument to the Landmarks Commission, I've got to say, Sarah Carroll and Meenakshi, they were all terrific. Basically, the argument we made was this was the historic condition. This is what Domino used to look like inside. These huge vats that had crushed up lamb bones in them. It's weird. And so you can see how the windows were fake, basically. There was no floor going up to that window. Steel tiebacks were holding up that brick facade. And we said we could design something that actually emulated that historic condition. That it was the new building slipping behind that brick wall with steel tiebacks. So it would rain and snow in the space. And so that's what was going to solve the problems of light getting in there and having a floor that you could get across. And we got approved by Landmarks, and Jed was crazy enough to build it. And so it's out there right now. It's kind of extraordinary. Lisa, the landscape architect, planted 25 pin oaks that are growing in that space right now. And so when you're in the space, there's something absolutely magical and ethereal of looking through real trees and rain and snow and then through a brick wall and out into the city. And so there's this sustainability issue in terms of maintaining the brick, but also the brick acts as a huge solar screen. So there's not much heat gain in the building. It's quite extraordinary. And then that pushed development rights to the top. And I won't go through this whole story, but we wanted to emulate the American round arch style. When you see an old factory building and it has brick arch windows, it's because there was a wood lintel in a previous iteration of that building, and that older building burned down because the wood lintel caught fire. And so we started building those brick arches to actually as a fire retardance device of all things. And so that's what the building is paying homage to. And so, you know, it is part of an ensemble of buildings that Jed is building out there. Part of why I think this, so going back to kind of where I started, so much of what we see today that's built, these big blue glass skyscrapers, you know, chain stores at the bottom, they could be anywhere. This can only be on the Brooklyn waterfront. It is change, it is growth, it is housing we desperately need, but the architecture is critical, not just of our building, but of all the buildings, because the community specifically said, please don't give us, frankly, the stuff that resulted from the Williamsburg rezoning. Don't give us just the banal glass crap. Give us something that actually is respectful of our neighborhood, even though it's significantly taller and all of that stuff. And so yes, so part of what I'm trying to argue, and I'm sure, I know there's a lot of people who are very serious about housing in this room. Housing is not widgets, and it's not just transactions about the percentage of affordability and all of that. All of that's critically important, but it's also people's homes, and their experience of that is incredibly important. So anyway, the building, we're always very concerned in terms of connective design of how it meets the street, how buildings meet the street. And so that plaza will still soon be filled with restaurants and cafes and things like that. And then there's that great kind of connective space, that space at the top of the building. Okay, a couple of more examples. This is leading to the housing conversation, because this is a project we're doing at Princeton. It's 511 dorm units in the heart of Princeton's campus. Princeton is, like all campuses, urban in its own way. This is a terrifying, again, site to build on, because that red building's a Venturi building, and there's a Todd and Billy building, and a Harry Cobb building, all cheap by jowl to us. And Princeton has all these sustainability standards. It's geothermal, it's mass timber. And so we worked to, what happened to that slide? I'll just go to this one. We worked to create a series of courtyards. The landscape at Princeton is incredibly important. So this is part of being true to the history of Princeton, and I'm going to keep going back to that first history slide, of building courtyards with the building. But then in terms of the architecture, so there's this kind of, there are certain people at Princeton that want everything to look like Hogwarts. We don't really do Hogwarts, and so we had to explain to them how we could pull history forward in some way that was more interpretive. And so we looked at all the conditions on the ground at the campus and came upon a material palette. This, for all of you housers out there, I cannot tell you how important this is to people. right? So that's the historic fabric of Princeton, the stone behind. We picked a brick and terracotta palette that emulated that down to the mortar colors. And so even though we're doing something that is unapologetically contemporary, in scale and material fits into the campus. And this is something that we've had very good dialogue with them about in terms of how to build what is actually quite a large building on the heart of the historic campus that emulates history, pulls history forward, but also this is Hobson College, donated by Melody Hobson, one of the most prominent African-American alumni of Princeton University. One of the challenges of Princeton is to get people out of the eating clubs and into more democratic circumstances in what is becoming a much more diverse institution. And so the architecture is meant to help do that. Okay, last few slides, just about housing. We've been working for a number of years with Gotham and Reverend A.R. Bernard on a site in East New York to build 2,200 affordable housing units, a range of incomes, a performing arts center, and a school around some public space. This was the sketch that made Reverend Bernard and I fall in love with each other. He had read his Jane Jacobs. He knew he wanted a lot of small blocks and a lot of entrances. He was very passionate, like where there couldn't be retail on the ground floor, he wanted social infrastructure, so 24/7 daycare, vocational training, things like that. This had to go through our rezoning process known as ULURP. We, I think, gained the community's trust and the council members' trust in about a year. It still took about 5 years to get through ULURP. It'll be 9 years from project conception to the first family moving in, which in my mind is madness. But we worked out all the heights, all the AMIs. The council member wanted brick. We were absolutely happy to oblige. That's a curbless street, which usually is something you see like in Copenhagen, not in East New York. And those lower units are home ownership units, and then rental is above. And so this is a very low budget project, a very low budget project. Yet we felt our fundamental thing was not to make Bay architecture, but was to create dignity for people to feel pride that this was their front door. And so I think we gained a lot of community support through that, so that's under construction. Now, that leads me to the close, which is 9 years from project conception to delivery. And I think that all points to a much larger problem we have in our society, which is we've got a conservative party that's telling us that our country is full, and we've got a bunch of progressive cities where people want to live, where progressives are telling us the city is full. And to me, that is incredibly, I mean, the signs on the right say it all, right? I know people have anti-developer sentiments and all of that. I do think better architecture helps move the needle a little bit, but not enough. And so some of you may have seen this piece we did with the New York Times about creating enough housing to house actually more than 1 million New Yorkers, but in a way that would be consistent with the character of our neighborhoods. So this had nothing to do with zoning, it had nothing to do with anything other than creating a series of self-imposed ideas about what would create new housing that was in keeping with neighborhoods that were either single-family neighborhoods all the way out to high-rise neighborhoods all across the city. And so we had criteria. It had to be near mass transit, had to be out of the flood zone. And we found 1,700 acres, 10,000 sites across the city that could house new housing. We used 3 different scales, right? Kind of small, medium, and large at different construction cost points. And said the new buildings can't be any taller than the tallest building in that neighborhood. And use that criteria to do these before and afters that some of you may have seen in the Times. This was the most controversial one. This is a very controversial 6-unit apartment building in the Bronx near mass transit. In Queens, at a grocery store, no, excuse me, that one's in Brooklyn. The next one's in Queens. 250-unit building. And then some office to residential conversion, which we found actually delivered very little new housing for the cost. And so, again, that totaled 520,000 units. Most of them are mid-rise. We also learned along the way that our real estate industry has no interest in building mid-rise housing in Queens and Brooklyn. Sorry, I showed that slide already. So this just, to close, I'm thrilled to see a presidential candidate, our vice president, talk about building 3 million new homes. We have a huge housing shortage. But my fundamental question is, what kind of housing? Where? And for whom? Because we have to remember the past. The federal government has a terrible track record, right? Both in terms of creating this through federal subsidy, through free highways, mortgage interest deduction, GI Bill, down the list, right? To create some of the most segregated housing ever known to mankind and some of the most carbon-intensive housing ever known to mankind. Or conversely, funding Tower in the Park housing, which I am not going to say is all bad. It's a much more complicated story than that. Pruitt-Igoe is a much more complicated story than this picture. There's just not enough time. But let's face it, not exactly a successful model, right? And so I'm all for building new housing, but will they talk to the architects and the urbanists before they go out and do this again, is one of my questions. We needed desperately the housing compact that the governor tried to, this is in Bellport, Long Island, where my wife and I have a summer home, and I did this rendering of new housing near the train station, and it drove everyone crazy because of how multicultural the rendering was. And so you say, well, like you look back at that slide, you know, it's 3-story housing. I'm very hung up on this module because you can build 3-story housing without an elevator as long as the ground floor is wheelchair accessible. You can't go to 4. Then you need an elevator. So your construction costs go up by a step function, right? And so you say, well, that kind of housing, what could that possibly do for the world? Well, you know, if those billions of people we talked about at the beginning of the presentation lived at that scale, that little white sliver is how much of the world we would use for land for housing. So we just spread out too much. And what that closes with is Kate Raworth, who's brilliant economist at Harvard, or excuse me, at Oxford, and she's one of the few economists I know who draws. So she wrote this book called Donut Economics. And she said, when you look at growth, and you look at the growth numbers, you can't just talk about growth for growth's sake. What you have to talk about is, how much growth do you need so people don't fall into the hole in the donut, right? The shortfall of not having a place to live, not having education or healthcare. But how do you not overshoot so we don't use resources that we don't have? So what she's suggesting is that most of us, 10.4 billion by 2086, could live in harmony with the planet in the middle of that in the donut itself. But the problem right now is that most of us either live on one side of that donut or the other. So I do believe architecture has a role to play in all of that, not just in terms of building, but like where we put every door, every loading dock. What does it say to a community? Does it invite them in? Does it repel them? Does it create the conditions for bringing people of difference together and creating good social friction around that for what I call nature, culture, and joy? We can have all of those things in our city, and we can actually build the Garden of Urban. So thank you very much.
I want to thank Vishaan, but I also want to take the prerogative of the chair and ask the first question, and then you can. You opened by saying something, well, I can speak for 3 hours about Penn Station. Can you give us 3 minutes about Penn Station?
Mitchell, always with the easy question. I am appealing to my 6th governor on Penn Station. I do believe we are not embarrassed enough. You will remember a few Junes ago, before the pandemic, there was a false alarm and 14 people got injured. King's Cross in London, the reason King's Cross and St. Pancras got redeveloped because King's Cross was the target of a major terrorist attack. It shouldn't take an architect to tell you that pouring 650,000 people through a facility built for 120,000 people with a 9.5-foot ceiling is a very bad idea. Spending $30 billion on new Trans-Hudson tunnels that we desperately need and building a new garden hose to pour more water into the same rusty bucket is a very bad idea. And what drives me crazy is that those of us who advocate for fixing Penn Station, and a state senator with whom I had a word with, said this in the paper that, you know, I'm not sure if we need pretty. The dismissal of things like putting 2 ADA elevators on every platform, of having enough vertical circulation to get out in an emergency, none of the platforms comply with the National Fire Protection Act. The idea that you would need enough visual clearance in a horrible event, or even, God forbid, on a normal day where you just want some dignity as a commuter, that you could see light and air and understand where you're going. Think about it. When you go through Grand Central, how many times do you have to look at a sign to understand where 42nd Street is or understand where Lexington Avenue is? The architecture tells you what to do, right? And so we're in an abysmal state of affairs with it. With congestion pricing gone, I do not know how the MTA can build anything there. And there is a significant public-private partnership proposal on the table that would put $1 billion of private money into it, which is precisely the way LaGuardia was done, and any number of other facilities are being done around the world. I hope it will be taken seriously now with congestion pricing on pause. And you know, I'll just close with this about Penn Station. When you think about, I'm just going to try to give you an analogous argument. We talk about gun control all the time, and we say, look, you know, no other developed country has this condition, right? Right? Europe doesn't have it, and so forth. Why can't we do the same thing with our public facilities? I mean, if we're going to compare ourselves to Europe when it comes to guns, how about infrastructure? I mean, have we ridden Crossrail? Have we been to Paddington Station? Have we been to, you know, so like if we're going to make those comparisons as progressives, let's make them all the way. And the other thing is, this isn't just about money. The amount of money that it's costing to build these projects in Europe is less in a unionized environment than what it is to build them here. So we have a major problem. Penn Station, post-pandemic, should concern every New Yorker because we are trying to get people back into an office environment, and we cannot do that if we do not give them a decent, honorable, safe, dignified commute. So I think I'm going to be a 96-year-old man with a cane outside of Penn Station, but I am going to keep fighting. I hope you do too.
Why don't we do this? We have a limited amount of time, so why don't we get, and there's a mic, is there a mic in the back? And there's a mic there. So why don't we get one in the back, let's get a student. Will? Okay, we have two.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much. This has been really wonderful.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about, in practice, kind of trying to implement this. So of course your firm wonderfully is successful, but I'm thinking about the times where I've been part of a team that's bidding on an RFP, and you, or we, right, not you, end up trying to navigate really wonderful and thoughtful design with just the budget of the project. And so I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the very low budget project that you mentioned in East New York.
Yeah. Sure. Are you an architect?
No. I work for a developer called
Okay.
Urbane.
Gilbane?
Urbane?
Urbane, yeah, sure. What we do is we work with the developer and the construction manager and the engineers really early on to understand the budget and understand the construction constraints. So that project in East New York is block and plank construction, right? And it's got very limited means for creating building depth and all of that. So you can't use really thick brick, you can't do a bunch of things, I won't go into a bunch of detail. But to us, it's always starting first with the constraints and understanding from the construction folks, the developer, and so forth. But then keeping in mind the larger community goals that were about, you know, brick and dignity, and then of course, there's this overlap of the AMIs that the project is serving, the median incomes. And so, you know, it's just taking all of those constraints and condensing them down into what is buildable, and starting from there, and then moving up towards, okay, can we use this material, can we use that material? We did end up convincing Gotham to spend a little bit more money in premium on a couple of places, just to get a little bit more texture in the brick, but it wasn't a big premium. But so it really started with, how are we gonna build this? And then trying to figure out how to do the best we can with that system. Okay, thanks.
I want to thank everyone here. I want to thank Vishaan. I think we have a limited amount of time, and some of you may want to talk to him individually, but I do believe because of our own time constraints, I just wanted to say thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Vishaan. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to come tonight. Thanks.